I'm going to get straight to the point. What are you going to find on this channel that you'll not find anywhere else? You will see a novel moral theory applied to the issues of the day. Since I was in high school, I've had an interest in what it takes for an act to be right or wrong, in what it means for something to be right or wrong, and how to know whether something is right or wrong. I've come upon some answers to those questions, and some of those answers are things that I have not seen elsewhere. I'm not talking about different answers concerning what really is right or wrong. On that score, I'll end up defending a rather conventional morality. I'm talking about different answers on what it takes for something to be right or wrong, and on how we can know. I expect your reaction to such an outlandish claim will be to think that it is, well, outlandish. How many people in human history have claimed to have discovered the true nature of morality and ended up presenting ideas that were quite foolish? The odds are far greater that I'm one of those than that I can present genuine answers. But the proof, as they say, is in the pudding. Allow me to explain some of those answers, and you can judge whether they actually make sense. And if you have some training in moral philosophy, either self-taught or formal, then you're probably already preparing some philosophical hand grenades to throw at my ideas. Objections that would be based on things like David Hume's distinction between is statements and ought statements, G.E. Moore's naturalistic fallacy, C.L. Stevenson's emotive meaning of ethical terms, or J.L. Mackey's error theory. I don't want to turn this into a series fit only for people trained in academic philosophy. Morality is meant to be used by everybody. However, I recognize and respect the power of these objections, and I will venture into academic philosophy. But I'm writing for a more general audience. I'm writing for an audience that, I hope, can understand these ideas and put them into practice, thereby improving the quality of everybody's lives. I'm clearly not going to be able to prove my ideas by the end of this video. It's a huge topic. In the space remaining in this video, I want to say just enough to make you think, maybe he's got something here. Maybe it's worthwhile to take a closer look. So let me get started on that. I want to start with a definition of what is probably the most important term in morality. The term wrong, as in, what you did was wrong and you knew it. The definition I will offer goes as follows. To say that an act is wrong is to say that people generally have reasons to use condemnation to promote a universal aversion to performing acts of that type. Here's a simple illustration. To say that it's wrong to break a promise is to say that people generally have reasons to use condemnation to promote a general aversion to breaking promises. We have reasons to create a society in which people usually keep their promises. This means that we have reasons to condemn those who fail to do what they promise, so as to create a reluctance in people to breaking promises. When people break a promise, without having a good reason, it makes sense to condemn and criticize such a person, in the hopes that this will make people generally, not just the person condemned, more likely to keep their promises. Does this mean that it's always wrong to break a promise? Of course not. If you promise to meet your sister for lunch and just before you leave your child falls and breaks an arm, your obligation to get medical care for your child outweighs the obligation to keep your promise. Obligations have weight. An obligation can be outweighed if something more important comes up, but it has to be something that people generally have reasons to recognize as being more important. I'll go into this feature, among others, in more detail in the next video. Here's another example. It's an example relevant to issues being discussed today. I'm going to argue that people really do have a right to due process. This means that before a government agent can legitimately deprive you or anybody else of life, liberty, or property, they have a moral obligation to prove the legitimacy of their act to a judge or jury. I said that I'm going to be applying this moral theory to events going on in the world today. Currently, the Trump administration denies that people have a right to due process. I'm going to argue that they are mistaken. On the theory that I'm presenting here, when I say that people have a right to due process, I mean that it is wrong to deny people due process. And when I say that it's wrong to deny people due process, I mean people generally have reasons to use condemnation to promote a universal aversion to denying people due process. What this means is that people generally, which almost certainly includes you, have reasons to see those who would deny due process like those who would commit other moral crimes. Moral crimes like beat their spouse or their child or commit rape. Denying due process is a contemptible act. Now, can I actually prove this? I'm going to start by arguing that you have reasons to see denying due process as a contemptible act. And then I'm going to assert that people generally are no different from you in this regard. You have reasons to have the same attitude towards those who deny due process as you have, I hope, towards those who would beat their spouse or children, or abuse your child or family member, or rape somebody that you know. This is because you have reasons to want to live in a society where government agents are not likely to grab you and throw you in a prison simply because that is where the government agent wants you to be, for whatever reason. I suspect that you're aware, perhaps through a study of history, perhaps through fiction, perhaps through personal experience, though I hope not, of tyrants exercising an unchecked power to make others suffer for whatever reason the tyrant may have to make others suffer. Perhaps the victim is somebody who criticized the tyrant, or perhaps the tyrant is jealous of the victim's wealth or popularity, or the victim has something that the tyrant wants, or the victim disagrees with the tyrant's religion. In particular, a religion in which the tyrant is God and is to be worshipped and obeyed as such. It is a very familiar story. And if it's not the tyrant that's abusing power and harming others, then it's somebody serving the tyrant and who the tyrant then protects that is choosing to make others suffer. The law enforcement officer, the local tax collector, the inspector, or the bureaucrat who recognizes that they can do you and others harm and that you have no right to due process that you can use for protection. The right to due process is an instrument that protects people from the arbitrary whim of government agents. Without the right to due process, the tyrant or the tyrant's agents can demand anything they want from you by threatening that no matter what it costs you to obey, it is less than what it will cost you to refuse. The right to due process, recall, is a right that you have to demand that before the tyrant or the tyrant's agents can cause you harm, they must first prove to an independent tribunal, to a judge or jury, that the harm that they would cause you is being done legitimately. In the paradigm example of due process, before the government can punish you for a crime, they must be able to prove to a jury, beyond a reasonable doubt, that you committed the crime for which you are being punished. They must deliver their evidence. They are bound to tell the truth under the threat of perjury. They can't just haul you off to jail and keep you there because it pleases them to do so. Those who claim that you have no right to due process probably believe that they will be the ones with the power to force you to submit, to obey, or suffer the consequences. Those who assert that they have a right to haul you off without due process are very much like those who think that they have a right to batter their spouse or child, or to rape. The people who wrote the U.S. Constitution were very familiar with these inconveniences of tyranny. This is why they wrote into the Constitution the following: No person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. It is right does not depend on it being written into the Constitution. The people of Russia and China also have a right to due process, as did the people in Nazi Germany. They had and have the misfortune of living in a country that does not respect that right, and they suffered or are suffering because of it. Do you choose to live in a country that denies people their right to due process? Now, I hope that it's obvious that what is true of you regarding the right to due process is true of almost everybody. And so it's true of people generally that they have reasons to have the same attitude towards those who would deny due process as they have towards those who would abuse their spouse or child or commit rape. Or in other words, it is true that people generally have reasons to use condemnation to promote a universal aversion to denying people due process as they have to promote an aversion to abuse and rape. On the definition of wrong that I started with, it is wrong to deny people due process just as it is wrong to abuse a family member or commit rape. To say that it is wrong to deny people due process is to say that people have a right to due process. And this means that you, me, everybody has as much of a right to due process as we have not to be battered or raped. Now, we hear the objection that the right to due process does not apply to the worst amongst us, the murderers, the rapists, the individual fleeing criminal bands who rape and kill within their own country to come to this country. That the truly despicable people have no right to due process. And I do hope that you can recognize sarcasm when you hear it. Now, I have to ask, how do you know that a particular person is one of the worst amongst us? The right to due process says that the government cannot treat anybody as if they are one of the worst amongst us until they have actually shown that the person really is one of the worst amongst us. In other words, the right to due process says that the government cannot treat you as if you are one of the worst amongst us until they have proved that you really are one of the worst amongst us to a judge or jury. This is where the slogan, presumed innocent until proven guilty, enters the discussion. This slogan means that we assume that somebody is not one of the worst amongst us until it has been proved to a judge or jury that they are one of the worst amongst us. It means that some abusive government official can't point to you and say that person is one of the worst amongst us. Take them away. They're going to have to prove it. That is the right to due process. That is your right to due process. Okay, let me review. To say that an act is wrong is to say that people generally have reasons to use condemnation to promote a universal aversion to performing acts of that type. For example, to say that it's wrong to break a promise is to say that people generally have reasons to condemn those who break promises, so as to make the breaking of promises less common. Or another example, to say that it's wrong to deny people due process, or in other words, that people have a right to due process, is to say that people generally have reasons to condemn those who deny people due process, so as to make the denial of due process less common. This means that people generally have reasons to use condemnation to promote a universal aversion to denying people due process. People who would deny due process should be looked at the same way we look at those who would abuse their spouse or their children or who commit rape. In fact, people who would deny due process, as history shows us, are typically much, much worse. If you think that I've said something that others should hear, then I encourage you to help make sure that they hear it. And one of the things that I have argued for is that it's important to protect and defend our right to due process. Either that, or we will suffer the fates of people who have lived or are living in societies where it is not protected. And if you think that people should know why the right to due process needs to be protected, then tell them. In the next video, I'm going to take the definition of wrong that I used here, and I'm going to break it down into its parts. I'm going to examine each of those parts in some detail, and then I'm going to put the whole thing back together again. This, I hope, will give us a clearer idea of what I mean when I say that something is wrong, as in immoral or blameworthy. And I'll be using a lot of examples. I hope that you'll come back and take a look.